It says here that I'm the correspondent of The Economist. That's true, but I'm specifically the Balkans correspondent of The Economist, and I've been asked to make some comparisons. I covered all of the Balkan wars, I still cover the Balkans, but I do know this region, the Black Sea region, a bit, and I have been to all of the breakaways. I've been to Transnistria, Karabakh, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and even Crimea too. What strikes me is that comparisons are often made, and of course the latest to come off the mill is Crimea is the new Kosovo. But what's really striking to me is the ignorance of Balkan people. When I say people, I don't mean ordinary people. I mean people who kind of follow the Balkans, experts on the Balkans, etc. Because when they make comparisons with the Black Sea, I realize that they know absolutely, really nothing about the Black Sea on this region whatsoever. And I have to say that that's true of people in the Black Sea region. They make very easily comparisons, but actually, when push comes to shove, people know very little about each other. I mean, you can ask a Balkan person will know the last detail of the ethnic composition of a small village in Macedonia or in Bosnia, but if you ask them to show them, if you ask them where on the map was Nagorno-Karabakh, they probably wouldn't have any idea. And until the current crisis, I suspect they probably wouldn't really have known whether Crimea was actually in Russia or Ukraine. But unfortunately, this has consequences, because with no expert or academic crossover, the opportunity for making facile and superficial comparisons is huge. And in 2014, in this age of globalization and internet, etc., instead of making people more enlightened, we have the possibility where we don't have people who can sort of counter ridiculous arguments that that governments and cranks and lobbyists can obfuscate and confuse people. And where there is a superficial comparison, and when we're talking about the issue of self-determination versus territorial integrity, that's what I see happening. Now, I've been here for a few days, and I realize that actually kind of what's been the interesting debate about this area, or debate in inverted commas, because some of it is really comedy-like, especially in the Balkans, it's not been reflected here, because again, it's something that's happening over there, it's something different. But let me come back to the sort of core part of the argument, and then I will explain. As you know, Vladimir Putin made his famous speech, when he signed the annexation of Crimea, when he said, well, that Crimea was basically just like Kosovo, and of course Crimea had been put like, as some people said, a sack of potatoes into Ukraine in 1954, so it was just righting historical wrong. Well, if you want to go down that argument, you could argue that Kosovo too had been in the wrong state, put in the wrong place in 1912 or in 1945. But of course it was a stupid argument, because no one in Crimea had been threatened, it hadn't come at the end of a cycle of wars, and don't forget that Srebrenica, the last massacre in Bosnia, was an important factor in decision making. But fine, Putin is making his point, but it really, really, really doesn't help when you have friends like President Obama rallying to your side, countering arguments by Mr. Putin. When he came to Brussels on the March the 26th, he's scoffing at Putin's speech, saying, and I quote, "Kosovo only left Serbia after a referendum was organized, not outside the boundaries of international law, but in careful cooperation with the United Nations and with Kosovo's neighbors. None of that even came close to happening in Crimea." Well, it sounds good, but the problem was it's just totally untrue. It's just, I'm sorry, the spirit of what he was trying to say was right, but there was no run-up, there was no referendum in the run-up to Kosovo's independence. You ask the White House about this, you can still see the speech, they've happily left the speech there, with its errors there. So who rushes into this information vacuum, so to sort of borrow a phrase here, but Russia today, people who believe in alien abductions and assorted cranks who can say, yes, the West is lying, Obama's lying, and there it is on the White House website. So it really doesn't help if people don't know what they're talking about. In the Balkans, what's happened is that reactions have varied. Montenegro, interestingly, which has seen a lot of investment, Russian investment, and is sometimes called Moscow on Sea, and lots of Russians go there, partly because it's the only place, I think, on the northern shore of the Mediterranean they can get to on holiday without a visa, is absolutely backing Ukraine, it's backing the EU sanctions all the way. Why? Because it desperately wants an invitation to NATO in Wales later this year. And there's a good reason for that, and perhaps they'll be even more determined, or they are even more determined. They want that invitation to NATO because, well, if it's okay for Crimeans to say, well, we want to be part of Russia, then what about people who consider themselves Serbs in the north of Montenegro who might one day say, oh, we'd like to be part of Serbia, please? In Bosnia, of course, divided as usual. Bosnian Serb leadership, the Republika Srpska, has 100% backed Russia against Ukraine, and incidentally, it wants a $500 million loan, please, to save itself from bankruptcy by the end of the year. But this means that Bosnia basically skulked in the cafe at the UN General Assembly with Serbia at the time of the General Assembly debate, and like Serbia, didn't vote. It didn't abstain, it just didn't vote. Croatia, Macedonia voted for Ukraine, and unless I'm very much mistaken, I think Albania did as well. But for them, there's really no dilemma. But the interesting one, of course, is Serbia. Now, Serbia this has been quite a lot in the press in the last couple of weeks, the fact that Serbia has done absolutely everything it possibly can to avoid taking a position. Why? Because Serbia's always tried to have it two ways. During the Bosnian and Croatian wars, it was in favor of self-determination for Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and not for the territorial integrity of those countries. When it came to Kosovo, it needed to do a 180-degree turn because it was in favor of keeping Kosovo, and therefore it was in favor of territorial integrity. The big shock came, the first shock, of course, came in 2008 when Russia recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Serbia's leaders were speechless, and they didn't really know what to say, so they didn't really say anything. They basically took the position, well, Russia is backing us, so we have no choice but to shut up. And that's pretty much what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Except it's been distracted partly by this ridiculous comedy of errors. They avoided taking an official position. They invented an excuse, which was that the government, they don't have a proper government because they've had an election, so they don't have a proper government. But that really was a ridiculous excuse. But it didn't help, and this is where I'm saying this ignorance doesn't help, whereby it was possible for the Serbian foreign minister at this point to invent an excuse to make a fuss, because a video of Mr. Yatsenyuk, which was put on YouTube in September last year, suddenly resurfaced in Balkan social media, where Mr. Yatsenyuk is in front of a map explaining the virtues of European integration. Unfortunately, somebody has made a mistake here, and the whole of Yugoslavia has been reconstituted, and not only reconstituted, has been renamed Croatia. So this really, again, doesn't help. It meant that the Serbian government was able to, instead of kind of be serious about, taking a position, the foreign minister was able to summon the Ukrainian chargé d'affaires to demand an apology for this ridiculous mistake. So then Ukraine, which was of course annoyed and saying, you stabbed us in the back, we didn't recognize Kosovo, was then having to apologize for a stupid map where somebody had made a mistake. So the whole thing became a kind of, as I say, this sort of comedy of errors. So I've got 30 seconds, I think. There are some similarities. I mean, I was asked to talk about avoiding mistakes. Well, I'm not so sure that these things are transposable. Milosevic, the Serbian wartime leader, never actually tried to annex parts of Serbia and Bosnia. So, of course, there was this is really a new situation, as everybody has said. Will there be some sort of blowback from Crimea in the Balkans? Well, eventually, one day, yes, they could be. If the Republika Srpska in Bosnia wants to break away, it will do what the Crimeans have done and cite the comparison. The difference is, of course, that Bosnia would go back to war. The difference is, unfortunately, when the chips are down, is that you can talk about the rights and wrongs of self-determination and territorial integrity till the cows come home. But at the end of the day, the fact is, geography is destiny. Ukraine's neighbor is nuclear-armed Russia, and the Balkan states are totally and 100% surrounded by the EU and NATO, which is why comparisons will be interesting. It would be good if everyone could get it right, know what they were talking about, but they won't be anything ever more than superficial.